Hey, viewers and viewers, my name is General Red Strategist, and welcome back to So You're Being Hunted, episode 726 now, I do believe. So, it's time for another podcast-style episode, I do think, ladies and gentlemen. It's an evening as I'm going to record this on a Tuesday. After a busy day at work, I just wanted to unwind by playing some games because my upload schedule is getting a little bit short. So I need to really record a bit of stuff. So basically I've recorded a couple of episodes of Tomb Raider 4 today. Sorry my words sound like they're blending together a little bit because I'm tired and all that, as I usually am. And plus on top of that, my frigging nose all of today has been feeling very stuffy and runny and just generally not very good. So apologies if it makes it sound like I have a frigging plug stuck up my nostrils. I honestly, can't really do anything about that right now. I took, some cold and flu stuff earlier, just in case, I've got a bit of a cold developing or anything like that. But, yeah, we'll see. We'll see how that plays out, in essence, ladies and gentlemen. But in the meantime, I hope you guys are obviously all doing well. And really, I wanted to do a podcast-style episode because I wanted to sort of talk about something that I did recently. So, like I say, it's early March. It's a Tuesday. Specifically, go on, I'll date the video. It's Tuesday the 4th. And been doing some interesting stuff actually at work these last few days. And I know normally, talking about work is really, really boring and stuff like that. But I don't know. I mean, I've talked about, obviously, education before, and I've vaguely alluded to things I do at work. But, no, hopefully what I'm about to talk about actually will be interesting and all that. Because the thing is, last week, I was away down in Portsmouth for a couple of days, helping out one of the courses who were doing sort of like basically what is basically an overglorified field trip and all that around museums and various odds and ends, which was pretty good. It was pretty good. I've talked about obviously Portsmouth before whenever I've visited that, so I'm not going to witter on about that. But yesterday, basically I should say, was on a particular learning activity, helping deliver it, which it's not the first time it's been run, but it's the first time I've ever actually been involved with it. Basically, one of the courses that I help oversee has recently added in what's called a Wargame, in essence a sort of tabletop educational game, which basically, in essence, it's kind of like it's like a military war game in essence. So you have a couple of teams. You have like a room where several tutors are acting as basically an exercise control, and they have sort of like a big map laid out on the desk and lots of tokens that they have to move around. And basically the idea is that it's sort of trying to recreate a hypothetical wartime situation or scenario. And you have like a blue team and a red team, so the blue team represents one side. So, in this particular case, it was sort of like it was a war game kind of constructed around a hypothetical conflict over Taiwan, particularly sort of around the Luzon Strait. And so one team is kind of like a coalition of Western states, predominantly UK, but also with units taken from Australia, New Zealand, Brunei, and then obviously on the other side, on the red team, they're representing China, People's Republic. And so the war game essentially kind of sets each team their strategic objectives, what it is they're trying to achieve. And then basically over the series of several turns, the two teams kind of manoeuvre their pieces on the board. The teams are actually split into separate rooms and have sort of people running to the exercise control to sort of let them know we've made this decision, we'd like to do this, etc, etc. And then the exercise controllers basically move the pieces around the board, they do the dice rolls to determine if certain actions are successful or not. And basically, like I say, it's the first time I've actually properly been involved with that, and I was one of the exercise control team. So basically, sat at one end of a table with a massive big sort of printout map of the Luzon Strait, with sort of the south of Taiwan at one end, etc. Luyan Island in the sort of roughly the middle, and in essence, over the course of a whole day, the students basically sort of battled it out. But war games are sort of an interesting subject in kind of higher education because, I mean, certainly in my own context at the moment, there's a lot of talk about this idea of the not to sort of bore you a bit with the kind of the buzzword, but the gamification of education, as it's called, i.e., thinking about how you can use essentially like war games, education, war games as kind of like educational activities, that kind of thing, or sort of design educational delivery in a way that sort of almost like turns it into a game, sort of that engages people, whilst also still being quite stimulating and intellectually thought-provoking and productive. So war games, particularly sort of like a big thing at the moment, just in terms of people thinking, could you sort of get educational value out of them? And a number of courses where I work are looking at incorporating them in one form or another into their course design. But it's really, really fascinating because obviously, there's a lot of considerations that you do have to bear in mind if you're going to do that. Because obviously you don't just want to play a war game for the sake of playing a war game for filling time. You want to play a war game and then use that as a reflective experience. You want the students to be thinking about why they're playing that game and what it is they're learning from it. So, having sort of like a military-style war game is intended to sort of teach, for example, students about things like the frictions of war, the fog of war, uncertainty, and what, someone like Karl von Clausewitz would have called chance, basically, in warfare, i.e. the potential for just, sometimes things just happen quite seemingly randomly, which can really throw a spanner into your best laid plans and all that. So it's kind of testing to see how do the students react to those circumstances as they unfold, and if, obviously, the dice rolls don't start going in their favour, how do they adjust their strategy, their plan, etc., etc. So, yeah, it was really kind of fascinating because, like I say, so this particular war game was centred around a hypothetical near-future scenario of conflict over Taiwan, or around Taiwan. And so it's sort of like the red team representing China, their sort of objective is that they need to take control of Luoyang Island, whilst the blue team, sort of the Western allies, their job, or their objective rather, is to basically just protect shipping lanes in the region, not necessarily to protect Taiwan and its islands. But what's kind of fascinating is how certain teams played across the game. So, for example, in one instance, the red team sort of actually took forever to land any actual forces on Luoyang Island, by which time the blue team had landed forces of their own on it to try and basically contest control. And of course, what ultimately sort of happened is the red team, several of the dice rolls basically did not go in their favour. They ended up losing a lot of their forces positioned on the island, and so as a result they had to sort of adapt their strategy whereby if they couldn't control the island, then they'd have to go for the next best thing, which is get all your remaining warships and air assets or whatever and just absolutely bombard the island to try and basically pretty much decimate any blue forces on there, that kind of thing. So it was a really interesting exercise and all that, and I just thought it was, I don't know, I wanted to kind of talk about it, mainly for a couple of reasons, because on the one hand, like I say, it's interesting from an educational practitioner's point of view, when you're thinking about this idea of the gamification of education, and what, how or what you might use those kind of things for in an educational context. Though obviously you do have to think very carefully about your educational objectives. What is it that you want your students to take from it? What do you want them to actually do? And therefore, how do you design it so that it achieves those objectives? Because obviously with war games like that, usually they have very complex rules and guidelines in terms of how they work. And so of course, sorry, I just knocked my microphone a moment ago then, but obviously the sort of problem with them is that the students, there's always kind of a risk that they become very fixated on the rules of the game and how to actually play it, rather than those kind of reflective teaching moments as they're going along. So you have to think carefully about the design of them in that regard. And the other things, you sometimes have to think about is would it be sort of the case that it works best with the team split into separate rooms, or do you have them all sat around one table, etc, etc? Do you automate any of the decision-making processes if you have software available? Or do you rely entirely on sort of dice rolls and human participants in the XCon to actually run orders and instructions to everybody? There's a lot of thought that goes into that. But, moving away from sort of an educational context for a moment and speaking more sort of personally, it was interesting as well because technically I think that's probably one of the... Yeah, that's like the first time I've properly played a tabletop game before. So, the thing is, like, tabletop games, I've sometimes thought about before in terms of, are they something that I potentially get into? And the idea is possibly, especially if it's kind of like a military style war game. I think those are always quite fascinating. But, moving away from sort of military style war games / Kriegspiels, etc., I think about obviously like other tabletop games. Obviously, a lot of people think of Dungeons and Dragons, for example, ones where you're a bit more playing a role. And I sometimes think to myself, one that I would be interested in is the sort of the Lovecraftian stuff by, I think it's Chaosium Inc. Because you know me, I love H.P. Lovecraft stuff. And I've watched a few videos actually by a Yogscast affiliated channel, Mystery Quest, Old Angori Tom, as a dungeon master, basically overseeing some Lovecraft-themed tabletop role-playing games, and they do look really, really fun. Because the thing is, I believe Chaosium Inc. basically, they do like a booklet, or they do booklets rather, which have sort of like pre-laid out campaigns you can play, where you can sort of create your character, devise their stats, and then with like a little team of people, do a sort of cooperative playthrough of a story, that kind of thing. And it sounds really, really fascinating. And, having actually played a tabletop war game for the first time ever, it does make me more curious about tabletop games in general. And obviously another big one that, most people probably think about, obviously, is Warhammer 40k, or, just regular Warhammer. And obviously, that's a fascinating one because of the amount of effort that goes into creating, all like the little pieces, the little models, every little soldiers and weapons and things like that. Which is, something that I've never really thought about before. But apart from that, I'm sure there are other sort of Warhammer-esque games, the way you use a lot of like miniatures, things like that. And so, I'm thinking, for example, is there not a game called Bolt Action? Something like that, which is World War II themed. I feel like I've seen it before. Possibly, again, actually in a Yogscast video, something like that, where you get like your little model German and Allied squads and panzers, stuff like that, and then you just enact little battles. Things like that, ladies and gentlemen. It actually also reminds me of that one time, actually, in a Syria Being Hunted episode quite a while ago. I talked about, what was that channel? Was it Eric's Hobby Workshop, was it called? The one who I talked about who made like a diorama video, who was making sort of like a diorama of a Victorian slum. Did I ever talk about that? It's, I think I did. For some reason I'm getting lag spikes all of a sudden. Feels like every Sir episode I do recently always has moments where the frame rate seems to stutter briefly. I mean, it seems to have smoothed out now, it's gone up. But yeah, that Eric's Hobby Workshop video, it's just made me remember that. Because he's basically a tabletop wargamer. And so, I think he particularly focuses on things like Warhammer, stuff like that. Well, of course you're near where I want to get to, Mr. Landowner. So could you imagine if someone did a Surrey Being Hunted themed tabletop game? Now that would be something, wouldn't it? Who knows? See, it's got me thinking now. Imagine if you took the techniques in that Eric's Hobby Workshop video for making sort of a Victorian slum out of bits of cardboard and other materials, or whatever, and you made a recreation of in-game Surrey Being Hunted buildings. You made like a landscape. What if you even tried to make your own little miniature figures of Sir Being Hunted robots and things like that? Now that would be something. There's a part of me that thinks if I was a bit more creative, I'd actually give that a go. And who knows? I say if I was a bit more creative. Maybe it's just a matter of finding the time one day. Something like that. But no, it would be interesting. Maybe that's a sort of something I should make a note of to try one day. Have a practice at it. Have a go at making some sort of 3D diorama that could go on like a tabletop wargame board or something. I don't know. It's just a random thought, that's all. Alright, I think we've been recording there for about 15 minutes or maybe just over. I think that'll probably do for an episode, just for a quick filler podcast episode and all that. So, hope you enjoyed listening to me ramble on about tabletop games for a brief moment, ladies and gentlemen, especially since I've now properly sat down and played one. So yeah, I'm hoping at some point, that maybe the course puts me back on that wargame exercise at some point. Because I did enjoy it, and I'd love to be in the exercise control again, just moving pieces around on a board or whatever. It's very, very fun. Alright, I'll tell you what, social media links, propagandist channel link, etc, all down in the video description for anyone interested. If you enjoyed, a like is of course always appreciated. Other than that, I'm signing off now. Goodbye everybody. Go straight ahead. Look at that there. Why is it a bit like we've gone into an ancient city? Or is this some freaking Lovecraftian city now? You know what? Let's go towards the thing in the middle where the lights are. Let's see what the deal is with that. How very strange. Oh well, into the water we go. This is only shallow, so we can still sprint. Thinking of that architecture in that area just a moment ago, maybe think of sort of Middle East.